For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, welcome to the Rewilding Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. This podcast is produced in partnership with Rewild Portland, a nonprofit organization, and is made possible through financial support from our patrons on Patreon. Thank you. If you feel inspired by this podcast, please subscribe, share it on social media, and write a review on Apple Podcasts. The best way to keep the podcast going is to become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. In this episode of the Rewilding Podcast, I talked with David Ian Howe about dogs and rewilding. David is a professional archaeologist trying to popularize the science of anthropology, most often through comedic videos. He is known for his interest and expertise in understanding ethnocynology, the study of the ancient relationship between humans and dogs. As rewilding is, in part, a critique of domestication, the relationship between humans and dogs is an interesting area of exploration. At what point does mutualistic symbiosis become parasitic, or vice versa? And is the human and dog relationship reflective of that? Listen in as David and I discuss this ancient relationship, among a few other topics of interest. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah.
I just kind of want to start by asking, well, first of all, I love your YouTube videos, and all your stuff is awesome. Your sense of humor is, I think, one of the most important parts about what you do in terms of education. I think having that component of humor is the thing that actually makes it sticky and interesting for people to watch. And so it's no surprise, I think, that you have garnered an online social media following because you just have a likable and very good sense of humor as sort of the core component of what you do.
Appreciate
and
that.
The main thing that I'm very interested in anthropology and all aspects of it. So I'm curious how you got into anthropology, and then what elements of anthropology are your favorite?
Yeah. I guess. Oh, are we allowed to use language on here?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Fuck yeah, I should say that. Yeah, I mean, for the humor aspect, it's just like we're all like, I don't know, we're all human. Like, we don't have to dance around it. So like, let me just talk the way I want to talk, and I think that's the most engaging way to get to people. And it just works for me, and it makes me more comfortable. But also, and I think it makes people more trustworthy too if you curse, because you're not just like, it's not like you're holding to some format, or you're trying to be like, a family friendly guy. But in terms of anthropology, yeah, man, I had just always loved history. I'd always loved like prehistory, like hominids and human evolution and stuff. And I was really interested in college in like the contact between like the Spaniards and the Mesoamericans, like that, just like, it's like a Star Trek level like moment in time. And I was fascinated by that, but I took history classes and I was like, I can't, like, there's no way I'm going to be a history teacher. This is awful. I don't want to do all this reading. So I took an anthro class as part of like an elective, and it was like archaeology, it was human evolution, it was culture, and it was history. And I was like, wow, okay. And I found out I was more interested in like culture clashing and more interested in like the technological, you know, what would be the word? Like the scales were way off on that clash, you know.
Hmm.
Um, so I just got really into anthropology, and that got me more into like how humans interact with their environments, or how humans use technologies, and how humans evolve, and how archaeological sites form. So I went to school for archaeology after that, studying hunter gatherers and stone tools, and that was really cool. And it just kind of went from there. But in terms of dogs, I saw a lecture by some professor who showed like the woman buried with the puppy in Israel, and I thought that was like the coolest things. Like I didn't know you could specifically study that, and I also didn't know dogs were around that long, so it just became like an obsession since then.
Yeah, awesome. Have you had dogs like your whole life, like growing up, or?
I think there's been like a year or two where I didn't have a dog in 30 years. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've always had them.
Um, so I have this like so I had dogs as a kid and I just was never I'm like a cat person, right? Which,
Mm.
um
I love cats,
no,
but
um I never had the incline to have pets. I always felt like there was this sort of weird thing. And then I think I leaned or I felt more aligned with cats because they were like they just seemed more dependent or I mean sorry, less dependent, and they seemed sort of like their own animal. They weren't like in my face. Um,
mm,
and then I feel so it's like a running joke with my friends that I hate dogs. I don't hate dogs. I actually love dogs. But there's this sort of I think contemporary relationship that a lot of people have with their pets. Um, that I don't like. And I feel like it's sort of exemplified in um, sort of like off leashness of like people who have their dogs who like run up to, kids at a summer camp. The dogs like rifle through their food, pee on their stuff. There's this sort of like
hmm
thing that happens. And then they hear me complaining about that. So they're like, Peter hates dogs. I'm like, no, I love
yeah.
dogs. Um, and I've never I think in my sort of journey through rewilding, I never really thought about the connection between humans and other than humans in terms of their partnerships beyond the sort of like subjugated ideology that I was projecting, I think, onto a lot of those relationships that I don't actually think is necessarily true, or that it can be that way. It can be other ways. And I think in like following a lot of your work, I started to sort of transform my idea around the concept of dogs being domesticated. And also I mean, in the way that domestication is defined oftentimes. Like I feel like there's this huge sort of um, umbrella that domesticate the word domestication gets used, and I think in a large part because wildness is sort of the antithesis of domestication. If domestication is like a thing that is no longer wild, um, then if we use that word to describe something like a dog, that it, from my perspective as a rewilder, it sort of it carries a negative connotation because of the sort of negative emphasis on domestication that we look at. Um, this is a very roundabout way of getting to my question to you, but
Sure. I get it.
the I've so late I think in like looking at your stuff and some other things, I started thinking about the branching of dogs away from wolves, and all the different theories around how that happened, and the way that people oftentimes define domestication is through one element, which is pro-socialness. So there's an article, for example, called like how humans domesticated themselves, and it's all just about being pro-social, not necessarily like the subjugation element that comes along with the concept of domestication. And then I started thinking about that with dogs as well, as this idea that potentially wolves and humans collaborated for a period of time. And then this sort of branching happened during that time of potentially mutualistic relationships. And then, you know, became something else at some other point. Where did the subjugation begin and end in terms of that relationship? So with that kind of framework around the relationship, I'm curious, like, can you talk about the evolution of dogs, the different theories, and um, I don't know, maybe this sort of like broader concept of domestication and how maybe there's different interpretations of it or something. I don't.
Sure. Yeah. There I like that you bring up the subjugation aspect because I also had that outlook as well and still do in a lot of ways, like with goats and like pigs, and especially with like just mass farming and like animal, like what do you call it? Like animal holocausting, I would say. It like that is terrible. And that is like a negative part of domestication for sure. But like back in the day, like in the Neolithic, like we were more living alongside goats that were just kind of in a pen in your village. They weren't like being truckloaded to the slaughter. Um, and you use their wool, use their milk, you use everything. And it was more of like a commensal relationship. And like they're not going to get attacked by wolves if they're living around us, kind of. It's just kind of exacerbated to this like very bad thing. Um, but with dogs and wolves, it's like, I mean, I can go into all the different theories, but I mean, for the most part, it's just that it was an inevitable relationship that had to form because humans being such social primates, and wolves being like the most social apex predators, it's just like you're going to interact with each other. And the current domestic or the current genetic evidence for like dog domestication comes from either Siberia or Beringia, actually. Um,
Mhm.
so it's in this very concentrated cold area where humans and wolves just had to like either adapt together or just, not perish, but like wolves would have disappeared before humans. Um, and it's just like this beneficial relationship because wolves can protect humans from predators, especially up there. There's like tigers and lions and hyenas, um, and bears, and then also like, I mean, just all kinds of them. And then also like they can hunt for you, and like they just protection. There's also theories that we were using their furs, because you have this thing that's following you that if, in the last case scenario, you can eat and use its fur. uh, it's just, yeah, it's such an interesting thing because it's not like a lot of people think we just went and roped up wolves and like gave them food and like now they're like, oh, you're a dog now. It's just not how it works. It was a long process of like wolves becoming slowly more, used to human life, and the dog is just a natural selected. It could be debated if it's artificially selected by us or it's them artificially selecting themselves, or it's a natural thing that they just kind of came to be. Like dogs are a wolf that is adapted to human life. Um, and I think when you look at it that way, it's less of a subjugation.
Totally.
But when you get to the Victorian period and we start scrunching their faces down just to look more human and cute, and they're wearing like, sweaters and stuff like that, it's a little more of an issue. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think too about the concept of artificial selection. And um, that word artificial to me is sort of one of the like challenging things because uh, how do you know what is like technically artificial or isn't? Like if something is being like, the difference between natural selection and artificial selection, right? What is the difference there? I mean, we can pretend or we can like say that one is it just gets into that concept of nature versus culture or
Sure.
whatever, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so that's kind of one of the things that I think about in terms of domestication too, as like, if you look in the dictionary definition, like selective breeding is one of the things that comes up pretty often. And I wonder how much of that was going on during the mutualistic relationship between humans and wolves versus, yeah, like you're saying, the Victorian era, where it's like very much like curated by not
Yeah. Good point.
the needs of the community as it's evolving in the landscape, but like this removed completely from the sort of like ecosystem itself and what the needs of an ecosystem on a grander scale are.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, and that's kind of where I think the sort of the challenge with domestication and in terms of all the different animals that are and plants that are domesticated is sort of like this transition between, um, the the needs of an ecosystem versus the like thought up needs of people, and then
Mhm.
the culture itself like imposing itself rather than being integrated into the system, the larger ecosystem. And I don't know, I don't think there's a way of like finding a hard line between any of that, right? I feel like it's a very much of a gray area.
Yeah. It, a researcher, Dr. Angela Perry, she does all like the genetic stuff, brilliant person, calls dogs a biotechnology. I just posted about this today, actually. But um, it just like we use stone tools or we use like, trees to make shelters out of, dogs are a technology that can be traded. They're a technology that can be like, I mean, evolved would be the word, like evolved, like we evolve our technology, stone tool, like making ways. You can evolve a dog to be more good at hunting. You can evolve a dog that has a better bark. You can evolve a dog that's faster for chasing things. And then, like across the landscape in the past, like when you're going to trade stone, you're going to trade like, mushrooms, you're going to trade, children for, relationships. You're going to be trading dogs too, or they're just going to be running up and having sex with each other because that's what dogs do. And that's
Right.
probably why it spread so fast, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a technology that has sprung from a natural like animal. It's like a robot that hasn't become a robot. Yeah, I can't describe it any other way. Like a flesh robot.
No, I know. Yeah, I'm currently reading some Donna Haraway. I don't know if you've ever read any of her work, but she basically like calls humans cyborgs because of a lot of different things. But
Sure. Yeah.
um, I'm reading right now. I'm in the middle of her book called "The Companion Species Manifesto: Dogs, People, and Significant Otherness."
Huh.
um, and it's just kind of along a similar track, I think. It's just kind of trying to fill my uh, as I work up through sort of like how to define or redefine or think about domestication. Just trying to read all of these different folks that have thought about this kind of stuff before. When you talk about biotechnology, it makes me um, almost cringe a little bit, just because I feel like there's there's like a level of objectification that happens, maybe in from the contemporary perspective of that. But I also think about like animistic relationships where an object is actually becomes an extension of self.
Mhm.
And so it's not necessarily just the way we think of like cold, dead machine things in terms of technology, but actually a piece of technology can be like a lived extension of the human body. And that makes me kind of, again, sort of look back at like this relationship with dogs and kind of think, am I objectifying this creature, or am I like, is it an extension of self? Are we like one and the same?
Yeah. That man, you always make me think. That's a cool thought. I hadn't thought about that. Um, yeah, like in a lot of mythologies, they are an extension of humanity. But in a lot of like archaeologically, especially after the Neolithic, you can see dogs are beaten way more, they're starved a little more, they're just kind of pariahs. Um, but in pre-agricultural societies, especially indigenous American, like dogs are revered, and they are treated like in that one mythology, like dogs had the chance to be human, but they couldn't get that capability because they're too promiscuous and gross. So the translation says, but like it's our task to care for them because they have nowhere else to go. And like in a lot of other cross-cultural studies I've seen, or like just around the world mythologies, it seems that there is this idea that dogs are not an animal, but they're not human. They're just dog. And I think that's like a really cool thought that they just exist on their own. Like there's not human and animal, there's also human, dog, and animal. And that's like a really cool way to think about it. And I wonder if that's how people in the past saw them
Mm,
as well.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's when you commissioned the artist to make the burial of the dog, I
Yeah.
mean, it makes me think of that. Like, what other animals are buried alongside humans?
Not many until now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's another awesome thought too, because it's you're not only burying people about 40, 50,000 years ago, but you're starting to bury about 14,000 years ago a dog. So you're taking this idea of like we're human, but also giving that dignity to another creature. And that's like a really interesting, we're definitely human at that point because you can think about it. It's meta, and like put it, yeah, it's just cool. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
On one level, I just had this thought of like, so here in the Northwest, when they buried people, oftentimes they would bury them with all their stuff, but they would break it all so that it would, like, for example, a bone awl. If you were buried with a bone awl, they would break it in half, and what because they believed that, and maybe some of them still believe today, I don't know, um, but they believe that if you break the things in this world, that they'll come to you in the other world, the next world, or whatever. And then when I think about the burial of the dog
Huh.
with the human, I'm wondering why were they buried at the same time? I'm wondering, did they like kill the dog to go? I don't know.
I I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like kind of like was it Qin Shi Huang, the Terracotta Army? All those soldiers and slaves were killed to like be with it. It's a crazy thought to think that someone had that much power to have an entire harem and like army slaughtered to protect him in the afterlife.
Yeah.
But that same thought though, if you die, your dog being like so attached to you, like mythologically, people would kill the dog to bury with you too, so that you had your dog when you were there. And that's like a more poetic thought than slaughtering a lot of people that are subjugated to you, but still
Right.
like the dog probably was killed. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Wow. Yeah. I never thought about that with those burials. Are there any just random question? Any cases of
Yeah.
horses being buried with people that you
Yes,
know of?
post and it's weird because horses you thought would be around for a long time. They're very new, like after like right about the time of Troy is where you start seeing dogs. So like 3,000 or some horses, sorry, 3,000 years ago, where they start being ridden at least.
Mm.
So they're very young, but once they start getting ridden or pulling chariots and things, you start seeing them be buried. Not always with people. They're usually just given like a dignified burial that's like kind of you'd think like a royal tomb would look with pretty chariots and horses laying next to each other and stuff. But
Huh.
yeah,
Interesting.
I do believe there are some human and horse burials though.
Hmm. That would make sense, I guess, like the Scythians or whatever, and
Oh, for
probably
sure.
have some of those.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious. There's a thing that happens to pigs. You know, this is a bizarre question that just popped into my head too. But
Sure.
um, when we think of pigs, we think of like hairless, tuskless, squealing creatures in a pen or whatever, right? And they'll stay that way their whole life if they're in a pen. But if they get out of the pen within a month and they're living in the forest, they'll grow hair, they'll grow tusks, and they become boars. And then you can never turn them back into like a domesticated pig again, right? It's like, I think it's called like polymorphic species or something along those lines. I'm wondering
Yeah,
if
I
there's
think you're right.
anything like that with dogs. Like if a dog becomes a feral dog, are there any like morphological changes that happen that you're aware of?
The dingo. It's 100% what that is. They were brought to Australia and either just went loose or they were let loose or something. But yeah, they're a domestic dog that was like it was a wolf that was domesticated that is now a wild dog again. So like and the whole species thing, dogs are all wolves in general. So it's just a feral dog um that has now become a wolf again. It's such a strange thought, but they do have like some morphological changes to their wrists. I think they don't lack a dew claw. They like have different
Huh.
double joints and things like that. And either that is a result of being domesticated and having their skeleton shrunk down a bit and then going back, or it's to interact with the Australian terrain. Um, but it is a genuinely cool thought to think that. And also, any dog that kind of, if you look at Mexico City or like other like countries where there's a lot of dogs running around, like the town or cities, they very they act very much like coyotes. And coyotes are thought to be just a natural dog. They're not a wolf, but they're not foxes. They just occupy this little scavenger niche, and they will hunt if need be. And that's what those dogs do too. Once they become like a pariah dog.
Interesting. Yeah. So wolves and coyotes diverged like 200,000 years ago, right?
Um,
Something along those lines, I feel.
it might be longer than that. I can't remember, but it's definitely shorter than we'd think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that they are considered two different species when, I mean, the standard definition of species is they can't have viable offspring, but they can.
Hmm.
And they did that study on the, eastern coyote, and it was like 30% wolf DNA or something. But that to me is confusing. If they're technically all wolves, then how do they, how do they calculate the percentages,
Yeah, and that's the thing too. It's like when is a dog and when is a wolf, or when is a dog a wolf? And it's all based on sample sizes. Like you have this much sample DNA of dogs versus sample DNA of wolves, and they calculate the differences. But like I posted a while, so in a sense that makes sense when you're looking at the numbers. But overnight you can't just call something a wolf. It's not Pokemon. So like you have what I think is just species as a spectrum. And like wherever, if you can make viable offspring, then yes, you're probably the same species, but some species can make non-viable offspring too. And like, what is that? So like when is a
Mm.
dog a coyote? When is a coyote? When they can all interbreed? And something I learned from a hunting podcast I was on was that black wolves don't exist naturally. They are interbred with dogs to get that black coat.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, never knew that. So Fenrir, like being a black wolf, is always like it's post dog. Yeah,
Wow, that's cool.
yeah, didn't know that.
Yeah, there's supposedly whole packs of black wolves in the Northwest, and I don't know enough about it to mention it, but one of my old
Yeah,
friends wrote a book about it, and I haven't read it yet. But
yeah, okay.
Wolves of Washington or something, I forget the title of it, but Dave Moskowitz, he's an animal tracker and has been doing wolf studies here in the Northwest for probably over a decade at this point.
Would
Um,
love to talk to that guy.
yeah, I'll connect you.
Oh, cool, appreciate it.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, so you mentioned dingoes. There's a book called Domestication Gone Wild, and I hated it and I loved it. um, I hated it mostly because again, there's like no real definition of what domestication means, and so there was wild examples in there, of this what they would consider a full-on spectrum. Um, and there was a chapter in there that was one of my favorites, and it was sort of comparing and contrasting hunter-gatherers and their interactions with dingoes prior to European colonization of Australia, and comparing and contrasting that kind of relationship to Mongolian shepherds in the Eurasian steppe and their relationship to dogs. And uh, the hunter-gatherers essentially would still use the dingoes like hunting dogs. Like they would go and the way they would gather, basically they gather them the similar way that the Mongolians gather golden eagles. They would basically go into a dingo den, take a baby out of it, and then raise the baby as a person within their culture. And I don't know how how they would train it or use it to hunt. Um, but eventually, what would happen is the dingo would reach like sexual maturity, which is like 2 years or more in a dingo or something along those lines, and be like, well, I can't have sex with these people. I'm out of here. And just like go wander away and find, dingo culture, dingo society again,
Yeah,
and reintegrate into that. And I thought that was really cool for two reasons. One, I thought it was like a great example of, um, symbiotic relationship, aside from maybe anthropomorphizing or not anthropomorphizing, projecting the concept of stealing a baby out out of a den. I don't know if stealing is the word to use.
sure.
A kleptoparasitism of children. I don't know.
There you go.
But the fact that they didn't put a leash on the animal and didn't selectively breed it and didn't keep it. It was essentially like a child reaching adolescence and then leaving like a family nest or something, right? And they treated the dingoes like family members, like people. They slept in the beds with them. They were like fed the same food, that kind of stuff. And then they contrast that with sort of the more I don't know how to describe it, but in the Mongolian cultures, they didn't consider the dogs people in the same way, and they weren't allowed to sleep inside. They were more like tools in an objectifying way, the way you're kind of talking about, like post-Neolithic. You see a lot more like abuse to these animals or whatever. It was
Mhm.
much more from that framework where they were selectively breeding them. And I just thought that was like an interesting compare and contrast between two kinds of relationships with that animal. Um, I don't really know what to say or ask around that, but I'm just, I think, when I talk about rewilding dogs, I think a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, I never leash my dog. I just let it go wild or whatever. Like, there's this interesting concept of wildness that people throw onto things like, oh, it just means nothing.
Hmm.
Whereas, I think that there's actually like a deeper relationship that can happen there between two different species if we can co-communicate together in a way that, I think about the same with like children. You don't just like let your children do whatever the hell they want. You teach them manners, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's not like you're not like, I'm training my child to be obedient. I mean, that can happen as well, right? That's like schooling. But then there's just like training members of society to understand the like cultural norms. And I think with like dog training, to me, it can be more perceived of as a sort of cultural communication rather than a form of obedience. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And yeah, man, there is the most toxic community I've seen on the internet is dog training. Because
Mm.
people, I'm sure there's more, but the ones that I've seen, it's like the force versus, just positive reinforcement, or like correction versus non, like those people hate each other. And it's like studying dogs for, I haven't studied them for thousands of years, but studying them in the past 1,000 years or 10,000 years, force has been used, and dogs exist. So therefore, it, not saying it's the right way to do it, it just has been a way. But positive reinforcement also does work really well. So I'm getting distracted from what you right now. I remember, right? So it's like the subjugation thing. It's more of like means in which to communicate with a dog. And yeah, if your dog is a lab and it loves people, sure. If it runs off leash, that's fine. My dog is a German Shepherd that could kill a child if it bit it. So, like, I don't want to let my dog run off leash. So, therefore, societally, I need to keep him a little more corrected next to me. Um, Positive reinforcement works, but I can't positive reinforce him if he has bitten a child.
Mm.
So, like, it's just an odd thing. And I want that to be like, it just depends on the dog and it depends on the area you live in, because he can, if he's born on a ranch, like he's meant to be a ranch dog. And if he was on a ranch running around chasing sheep like the Mongolian herders, he'd be in his perfect environment and wouldn't need to be corrected around children. But uh, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to get too into the weeds on that, but it's just interesting how there's so many different things, and it's because of human culture. It has nothing really to do with the dog. Um, and the dingo aspect too. I was trying to have a Tori paint me draw me a thing about Australian dingoes and Aborigines, and getting a consensus from different, because there's not one monolithic Aboriginal tribe. I could
Totally.
ask a bunch, what was the relationship with dingoes? And a lot of archaeologists have told me that before humans or before Europeans got there, it was like there's no way to know what they were doing with dingoes because it's just oral history.
Totally.
But like then some people said that they've always had dingoes, some people said they didn't. And it seems like their relationship was kind of antagonistic at times because they would steal kangaroo kills. And then they use domestic dogs now, Aborigines, but those were brought by Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
So like now that they have domestic dogs, were they learning how to do that with dogs and then just like, oh yeah, we've always done this with dingoes? And like it's just this mistranslation that like I'm not sure, but there's paintings of dingoes all over Australia, so I feel like they were using them.
Totally.
um yeah, sorry, I think I went way far from your
No, that's
question.
awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is just we're gonna meander.
Yeah.
um, yeah, I've been more and more thinking just about, I don't live out in the wild somewhere or in the country or something, and I feel like, and I've never wanted to have a relationship with a dog because of the way that I felt that it was sort of inherently uh, a form of subjugation. But I feel like through, studying domestication, coming across your work, I've really like actually now wish that I had more of a place to roam for a pet or of that nature, because I really do feel like there's an important element of wildness that is these types of commensal relationships that can happen. And I think, well, there's this whole other conversation for me that is sort of uh, that this gets into that is kind of a sidetrack, but it's a core component of rewilding. So I'm just going to kind of mention it as a part of this. But um, the idea of basically humans figured out how to extract like every single calorie from a landscape, and using all the different kinds of tools to do that. And dogs, in a sense, the sort of collaboration between dogs and humans allowed us to get even more calories out of an environment, which to me is like very deeply connected to the sixth mass extinction and our inability to be limited in our growth.
Mhm.
And so I'm very like, I don't know if there's no solution to the predicament of we can eat whatever the hell we want and we're going to do that. But when I think about animals that we've domesticated along the way, that a lot of people think of rewilding as like running away to the wilderness or just like abandoning anything that's domesticated, however we would define that. But to me, that's kind of like a shitty thing to do. I want to rewild with the other domesticated things, right? And so, like holistic grazing, for example, with like cattle is like a way of sort of
Huh.
rewilding that relationship, and same thing with any animal really. I don't. So anyway, I appreciate that you've got me rethinking around how to reconnect with these different species. And one thing that I wanted to ask you about was
I like that
neoteny.
point. Yeah.
And how has that affected, like, what is neoteny and how has that affected dogs in terms of wolves? Is that a way of like kind of being able to differentiate them physiologically? Has neoteny affected uh, the wolf to become more like a dog? Is that sort of maybe a line to sort of think about the difference?
Yeah. So neoteny occurs in all domestic animals, which is just very interesting to me. And it seems to be some kind of chemical thing that happens with what's called neural crest cells. Um, and when something is domestic, and its like face gets scrunched in a little more or whatever, like there are literal like cells that don't go to the ears and don't go to the face and stuff that stop it from being like perked up like a wolf, that make it flop down. And like obviously you can breed that out of certain dogs, but um like with cows, like the aurochs is the I don't know, the aurochs, the original cow, it's gone now, but it had such huge horns. But now like some cows just don't have horns, and like you're making them cuter, and that's what neoteny is. And like rams and goats and ibex and goats and or mouflon and sheep, like they're all smaller, and it just gives them less intimidating appearance, or a less intimidating, and that's what makes them domestic. It's just an odd thing because it's not even a word we put on it. It's a chemical thing you can see
Yeah,
in an animal that makes them domestic. Yeah.
it's fascinating. So do you think maybe it's like I mean, if a huge part of what we call domestication is pro-socialization, it could just be that it's like some sort of biological thing to make people feel less intimidated to so that they are more prone to being pro-social or something along those lines. I don't know. Because my question too, does it happen to like so in the silver fox experiment? This guy in Russia like bred foxes over and over again to try to make a domesticated fox, and he was able to do that successfully after like 12 generations or something. But he also did another group where he was breeding aggressiveness, qualities of aggressiveness. Did that? Uh, do you know if they had neoteny as well?
Um, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't think they did because I think he would have mentioned that, or it would have been more of a like prominent part of the study. He could have said it, and I just didn't
Yeah.
strike out at me at the time. That's a good question. I can go back and look. Um, yeah, that experiment was very interesting. Um, in a lot of ways. And to me, it makes me wonder like how quickly dogs actually were domesticated, if they were selecting for it, but if it
Mm,
was just natural, probably a very long time.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
How old is the oldest dog DNA?
Um, to let's see, trying to think of a word to use here. The agreed upon, like what is definitely like anybody could look at and say this is a dog, is 20,000 years. But before that, I have no doubt there were dog like things. Because again, when do you when is a dog a
Totally.
wolf? Yeah,
Totally. Yeah.
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 Or when is a wolf a dog? I mean,
Um, cool. I found my all of these notes that I had to
yeah.
talk to you about, yeah, that I took watching all of your videos.
Oh,
Um,
I appreciate that.
uh, so yeah, how do humans use dogs to hunt? Like, what is
Um,
that? What is that? I mean, I know there's like, well, I'm sure there's a lot of different ways. So I'm curious if you could share some of those.
yeah. So I always preface this: I haven't hunted with dogs, so I can't speak to it on a personal level. But I've talked with enough people and read stuff. Um, and I don't like you said you've not had a dog to do this with, but if you have been around a dog off leash in the woods, it's like a very different experience than walking with a dog in the park on a leash, you know. They sniff the ground, they like lick things. Like if my dog really likes something, he'll like stick his tongue out and like his teeth will like come out and like lick it, and then he'll like play around with it. So they're exploring the world through their nose. Um, and I tell people this a lot too. The reason dogs will go right for your crotch or lick your feet or your shoes is because like they literally see like the gas emanating from there, because that's where like we have sensitive smells, or I would say potent smells. Um, and like they see that smell, like they don't like, I can't describe it any other way. And so therefore they go right for it. And in the woods, when you're hunting a dog or hunting a, you know, a boar or some kind of like bird or something like that, they can smell and like see the gas in which like the animal has left behind and chase that. So like out there, they're like seeing the world the way they should. And I think that's part of like why I find what you're saying so interesting too, because it's like if they live in a suburban house and they're not allowed to walk and they're being corrected on a leash all the time, they're not seeing the world right. They're not being a dog. But when you're out there hunting with a dog or just walking with a dog in the woods, at least they're living up to their potential a little more. And I've heard from hunters who are like very animal conscious, and like, you know, one of them was vegan but he eats hunted animals. That was an interesting talk, but I respected his point. um like there's no better, like there's no closer to the relationship that we should be having with dogs until you're hunting. And like you won't understand it till you do it. And I was like, wow, I really kind of want to
Mm,
see it now.
mm,
But it's what they are for. It's a wolf doing its thing, and it's like the excitement that your dog gets from chasing something and then catching it is like all it ever wants to do.
mm-hmm.
And like it's pretty cool to think about. And yeah, apparently from the researcher I talk with a lot, she studied hunters in Japan and in the American Southeast, and said it was equally as entertaining both ways. But hunting boar and like just your dog just takes off after an animal, and like you might not see it for an hour, but you'll hear it barking and screaming until you come get it, and it has the animal pinned down or up in a tree, and it's just incredible. It's like an AI. Like
Yeah.
it's cool. Yeah.
It makes me think too about have you read Wolf Totem?
No, but I love the song.
I've never heard the song.
It's a
uh,
Mongolian throat band.
oh, okay, nice. Yeah. Well, in the the book is partly fictional, partly historic, whatever. I don't know. It's hard to kind of say what it is or isn't. But one of the things that they talk about in there is this sort of theory that humans, or that, Genghis Khan or Shanghis Khan, however you say that, developed his hunting strategy by observing how wolf packs hunt. And there's all these like stories of wolf packs hunting. I don't know if any of that is real. I don't know how, the intelligence of wolves work in terms of their collaborative hunting strategies. But one of the things that also I hear a lot about is how humans are essentially mimics. And, we've learned a lot of survival strategies migrating around the world by mimicking other apex predators. And so one of the things I think about a lot is like, did humans, in part become such good hunters by observing how wolf packs or hyena packs or whatever are, would hunt things? And is that one of the reasons why it made such an easy transition for us to live with wolves? Because if we had the same prey and we were, both working on getting those things instead of competing, like, it makes me think of like hybridization, right? So, the eastern coyote is 30% wolf DNA, whatever that means. It's hybridized back into its other forms or whatever. And so I think about this potential of like, the coyote and the wolf differentiated theoretically to avoid competition. It's one of the things that happens in evolution, right? If there's too much competition, species will diverge. So, but then it also can hybridize back together again if there are conditions that require that. Anyway, so I'm just wondering about the fact that if humans and wolves are competing for the same prey, what's the potential that we hybridized with wolves in a sense, or wolves hybridized with us and became dogs as a way of minimizing the competition? I don't know. That's just like,
I think that's it right there. It just minimizes the competition, and that's why we have dogs. Um, yeah, that's a good way to put it. And also, there, the question of like, are we learning from dogs how to hunt or wolves? Absolutely, I think. But there's also, we have to think about too, we were in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years before we left Africa, and we're hunting just fine. And there are wolves, and there are like painted wolves and hyenas in Africa to learn from. Um, and there's no doubt that once we leave Africa, we like book it to every other corner of the earth. And there's a lot more wolves hunting larger fauna up there that we hadn't seen before. So therefore, learning from wolves or hyenas how to hunt, or how to steal prey from hyenas and how to hunt for prey with wolves, it's definitely a thing that happened for sure. And like we are mimicking like monkey see, monkey do, literally.
totally.
And yeah, like the French and the Spanish and the Americans when they were here, noting the indigenous populations, like they would hunt wolves or hunt animals like wolves, and would talk about it. So like them being an extension of prehistoric or pre-Neolithic times, I would have no doubt we were doing that over here too. So
Yeah.
it's cool.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Your focus in college was on projectiles. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is your take on the overkill hypothesis?
Yeah, man. I love this talk, and I'm known to be the qualifier of everything, but it's because I genuinely feel this way. Yes, the climate was changing for sure. Just it was generally going on that path. There were mammoths dying out and whatnot. If the impact hypothesis is true and it significantly killed off a lot of species, cool. Then it probably did. However, humans entering at the same time and then everything going extinct can't not be correlated. I don't think it's the only thing, but an asteroid and humans coming in with dogs doesn't help any species numbers. And that's where I'm at with that. And it's interesting too, because once humans get to Australia 40,000 years ago, all their megafauna goes out too. So you can't say it's not related, but I don't think we were hunting every last single one of them. Yeah.
I read somewhere that there isn't a lot of like that the main, yeah. I get like, I have a Google alerts for things, and overkill hypothesis and stuff like that are on there.
Awesome.
So like every other week I get not so much anymore. I feel like it's quieted down for whatever reason, but there was like a time period where like one week I would get an article. It's like climate change is the culprit for the megafauna extinction. And then the next week it would be like nail in the coffin on this debate. It was humans that caused it. And then the next week it's like humans are off the hook, it just like goes back and forth. Right. And and there's just some interesting stuff out there. Like I didn't understand that that like the disappearance and reappearance of like the mammoths, for example, and the size differentiation. Like they disappear for like 10,000 years, and then they show back up again, and they're like half the size that they were. And there's just like all kinds of interesting things that were happening. But one of the things that I read when I was looking at that, and I don't know if it really holds true anymore, was that it said that there really isn't any evidence of projectile weapons on any other large species other than mammoths, or that the majority of evidence of like, deaths of animals in prehistory are like mammoths with like, obviously score marks on them from processing or projectile. And that one of the like arguments against the overkill hypothesis was that there isn't a ton of evidence of humans predating on much of anything else. Is that still true, or is that just like?
Yeah, there's a lot of dead mammoths in North America, but there's only like, I think, like you can count on your fingers how many like confirmed kills with humans there are. but it's very difficult to find projectile points with, like, you can see mammoths that are butchered, but it's like hard to say that if they were hunted. And the site that we've been working on, there's one with a projectile point that was right near the site with mammoth blood on it, but can you say it was hunted with it, or were they just found it stuck in the river and took it out? um but yeah, there's no doubt we were eating them and processing them and doing stuff with them, but did we hunt every single one of them? I'm not sure. And yes, bison antiquus and bison were I think the only other animal that I know of that have projectile points with them, along with mammoths. But we do have like cut marks on all other species that were here that we were eating too. So it just might be that the projectile points aren't there, or we were just, using a stone sling. We were doing something.
Totally.
We roped them. Yeah, just anyone's ball game.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you hunt?
I have once. I've not done it. I don't do it avidly. I would do it again for sure. But I don't necessarily need any of the meat, so I just feel weird just going out to do it.
Yeah. I had a friend who was like, my one goal is to walk naked into the wilderness and make a bow and arrow and like hunt and kill a deer. I want to be the first person to like just show that can be done and do it. And that was like 10 years ago, and he hasn't done it. So
there's a whole show about it now.
yeah, right. Cool. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to mention too is like that wolves and even coyotes, like they also collaborate with other species too, besides people. Wolves and ravens have an interesting relationship, right? Where the ravens will basically play with young puppies and get them to learn to chase them, and then they'll like identify where to go to hunt. And then the wolves, they can scavenge after the wolves have hunted and left their kill. And then one that I found out when I was kind of thinking about, when I'm trying to look into other interspecies collaborations that could lend themselves more to along the lines of how I would like to see humans collaborating with other species and not subjugating them, was this one about coyotes and badgers working together, and that badgers can actually like dig down into burrows that coyotes can't get to. And so coyotes will chase like prairie dogs, and then the prairie dogs will like go down in the burrows. The badgers can go down and get them, or get them to, go down in there, and then they'll run out a different hole and the coyote can get them. And then they like share the meal.
Whoa. I never heard that. That's cool.
Yeah. But it's a seasonality thing. So it only happens during like particular times of the season. And it's actually been seen as a regular thing. It's not just like some random thing that happened once. But there's this theory that the coyotes are the ones initiating the relationship because they're more pro-social. Anyway, there's some really cool stuff in that regard. I think I was looking at that because you mentioned just the sort of like, in one of your videos, just humans and wolves creating this sort of like, machine that could kill on such a higher level,
Yeah.
And it's true. And so how can that, anytime there's a sort of new thing that happens, if new calories can be unlocked at a higher level within an ecosystem, then it's going to happen, right? Like a predator is going to consume its food supply until the food supply drops. And, it's the Lotka-Volterra cycle of population, right? Of a food supply and a species fluctuating. And so I think about that with the overkill hypothesis too. Like if dogs are 20,000 years old, known, right? The DNA is known to be 20,000 years old. What's the potential that it was actually 60,000 years and it does coincide fully with the overkill hypothesis, or even just with the expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa? I don't know if, anyway, is there evidence of interspecies collaborations in that regard among like any other humans besides Homo sapiens?
Oh, like other humans.
Like, did Neanderthals have dogs?
There's a book about that actually. It's not that they had them. There's the idea that humans and dogs teaming up are what kind of drove Neanderthals to like their population being so small, because we're just so much more efficient at like managing an environment or like utilizing it as we go through it than Neanderthals were. And like once dogs come about, maybe that push just goes like really fast. But I think someone's asked me the same question, and my answer was like, yes. I think like no doubt a Neanderthal threw a wolf like some meat at one point to get it away, or like killed it. And either giving it food or killing it is still not artificially selecting or
Totally.
naturally selecting. So do I think they were running hand in hand together? I don't necessarily think there's no evidence for it, but it's not impossible.
Yeah.
And it's very rough to say that in archaeology, saying it's not impossible because that leads the door for like aliens and everything. But in this case, I think it's pretty not far to say it's not possible. It's not, it could be possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, another thing that, well, another thing that I think about is, like the oxytocin in some people call it the love chemical. Other people have realized that because you can actually have oxytocin release when you're abusing people or being abused,
Oh,
it's no longer thought of as just a love chemical, but as a connection or related chemical, which is
didn't know that.
why, yeah, I found that out recently because I was posting about the same kind of thing on on social media about
Oh,
dogs and stuff, and people were like, "Well, actually,"
oh,
so
yeah. My
yeah,
biggest
which
fear.
yeah.
Yeah.
I looked that up and I was like, oh wow, yeah, surprised to find out that oxytocin isn't just this isn't necessarily a love chemical, but that it's a kinship or related chemical, and I just think about that too in terms of our
Bonding.
coevolution, yeah, and like you were saying earlier, there's evidence, or there's these two different camps, right, of training, which is one is the force camp, and the other one is the or the physical force versus positive reinforcement. And I just think about that too. It's something like oxytocin and its relationship to those two different kinds of things that can happen that can still connect species.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know.
Huh.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, well, on that note too, I also was researching and I found out there's riot dogs because oftentimes you'll post about like the use of police and dogs and things like that on social media of too much whatever, all the different people who have their opinions about all that stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but then I was looking at somebody asked me if I knew. I posted a thing like, "What does rewilding dogs look like?" or blah blah blah, and somebody posted a link to riot dogs, which I had never heard of before. Are you familiar with the riot dog?
Just like police dogs or
So in the like Athens, Greece, like uprising a few years ago, there were like five or six different street dogs that became famous because they would always come and fight or whatever that means on the side of the protesters.
oh wow. Okay.
And I just like, that was just such an interesting thing of like essentially, I don't know if every feral dog sides with the protesters, but it was like an interesting sort of visual anecdote about wildness versus
Interesting.
the state and the training that goes into a dog that would be working for the police or something versus a dog that was like autonomous and being and choosing a side.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, a whole bunch of them became famous on social media and got named and were whatever.
Huh.
um
Didn't know that. I will say I got plenty of time, by the way.
cool.
But a long time ago, I posted something about the Anthropocene, and I think this is when I first like found your page, and you had commented, and at first I thought it was like a snarky, just random person
When I
commenting.
actually do.
Yeah, but like I read it as that at first, but then like I went back to it like a few days later because like I had gotten and I was reading through it, and I was like, that's actually a really fucking good point. And you said that saying the Anthropocene or whatever, I forget what it was, but you're saying it would be civilicentric, and like instead of like not ethnocentric or something like that. But I was like, huh. And I like started thinking about it, and I went back to your comment, and I was like, hey man, that was actually a really good point. I don't know why I got so defensive at first, but I forget what the whole thing was about. I should have looked it up before this, but yeah, like you have very interesting takes on like things from that standpoint, and like it definitely changed my mind on that. Um, and do you remember what it was? I can't fully remember.
Yeah, I don't fully remember, but what I remember about it was that I don't often engage with people on social media, and I did feel like I was worried that you would interpret it as an actually, and I don't think we had interacted at all at that point.
Mm-mm.
Um, what I really appreciated about it was that like I feel like it was actually weeks later that you came back and you were like, actually, you know what? I think that's a really good point. And I was like, oh, this person's fucking awesome. Like,
Oh, appreciate it. Yeah.
I was like, wow, okay. Like, that's very rare, I think, for people to think about things and change their mind about stuff. So it was one of those things where I was like, wow, okay. Uh, I don't know. I got mad respect for you.
Oh,
It just was one of those things where, yeah,
appreciate it. I think that's the ADHD thing for me because it's like I'll just randomly get a thought. And like I remembered your comment and I went back and I was like, I think that was a good point. I was like in the shower or something. And I
totally,
went back and I looked it up and I was like, yeah, he's right. And it just like I'll just get like random things like that. But I'm
totally. I
glad
do
to
the
know
same.
people respect it. But
Yeah, I
yeah.
do the same thing, and that's why I feel like it's like a sort of like thoughtful humility. I feel like I'll initially oftentimes reject ideas. I think that's just like one of those intrinsic things. Like, there's I think an Atlantic article that I send people every once in a while. That's the title is "This article will not change your mind," and it's just like about how people's minds get changed or whatever. And so I'm super resistant when people will post things oftentimes. And then yeah, same kind of thing. I'll think about I haven't been diagnosed with ADHD, but my friend Sheila, ADHD coach, she's
Mm,
like, you might have it. I have major depressive disorder, which is comes along
similar.
potentially.
Yeah.
Um,
I think everyone's got it on a spectrum.
mhm.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. But
Um,
yeah, that brings up the point of like your ADHD video, which I really appreciate. And I don't know if you want to talk to that at all in regards to
yeah.
like the theories around, um, you know, I love your video so much because it was so comprehensive. Your video on is ADHD like, is it an evolutionary adaptation or is it like a problem of modernity? And which way? Who knows? Like, let's talk
Yeah.
about all of it. Like, I just loved your video was very comprehensive in that regard. And I don't know if you want to mention anything in short or
Yeah.
summarize it here, but
I appreciate that. Actually, like it came to me in the shower, like most things do, because I like argue with myself. So I
yes,
was like the me and then the prehistoric me talking.
yes,
And then the Neolithic Nate, who
yeah.
like I hate doing, but it's just funny to me. And I was like, oh man, I gotta go film. So I just like literally spent all night filming that whole video, showed it to my friends at work the next day, and they were like, you really need to be like, they loved it, but like you need to be a little more positive about ADHD because this is very dark. And I
Mm,
was like, oh,
mm,
okay. So I
mhm.
added the whole part with Darwin
It's
where
so
he's
good.
talking about, appreciate it.
It's so
Yeah.
good.
And that was all at a friend who was like, you're very smart and you have a following, so you need to like not just make
Mm,
people sad with
mm.
this video. So I made that, and the person made me think too. Again, like you're right. I have to. There are
Mm,
benefits to it, and
mm,
therefore,
mm,
yeah, like it's I, I I mean, that's why I like what you're doing. There's just no need for a kid to sit 8 hours a day learning how to do math that he's never going to use again.
totally.
Um, and like some of us do use it, right? And like then you're told like pay attention. Like so it just doesn't work.
Yeah. I
Um,
had a kid in my nature program. I run like a homeschool program, and this kid who is in school 4 days and then does the nature program one day, he was like complaining about math, and he's like 8 years old or something, and I was like, you know what? You don't need to learn math, okay? Like it's pointless. You're never going to use it. If you do, you can use a calculator, right? Blah blah. And then we move on. We're doing other stuff. I forget about it. Of course, the
yeah.
next week comes by, and the mom is just like comes up to me, and I can just see her demeanor is
Oh
not
no.
happy, right? She's just
Yeah.
like, yeah, well, he was going to do his math homework, and then he said his teacher Peter told him that it was pointless and that he didn't need to do it. I was like, oh shit,
Yeah. Yeah.
sweating.
But I mean, you're not wrong. But yeah, that it's another aspect too to it for me is like geometry I could do because I could see the
Mm,
point of it. Like it made
mm,
sense. You're trying
mhm,
to find that. But
mhm.
like X, Y, and then like they brought I into it. I was like, get out of here. Um, and like it, um, like I had to barter with teachers, and I would
Mm,
like, in I didn't do this in college, but in high school, I like definitely like phones had just come out where you could text each other, or smartphones. So I would like text ads like question, can you give me the answer to the test, like mid test, which and was using technology to my benefit. Um,
amazing.
and
Yes.
like I passed classes that way, and other teachers who like it's unfortunate because a lot of like I wouldn't want to say boomer, but like older teachers don't really know about ADHD in a way to see it in children. They just think like, oh, the doctor will tell me if they do. So like for me, they just didn't know what they were like. Why is this kid struggling so bad? And
Totally.
then it was like, okay, he's literally struggling. Let me help him. And then they would give me good grades
Mm,
because I'm smart and everything else.
right.
So it was just like a weird way to go through life. And then like when that video, it's like people with ADHD are very beneficial to society at specific things. Um, but other things like I just can't I can't sit still and like
Totally.
have a full coherent sentence ever.
Totally.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I ended up, that's, in a large part why I ended up dropping out of high school, and
Oh,
running
you
away
did?
from home. Yeah, I never went
Oh,
to college. Well, I tried college for a minute and I ended up just arguing with the professor the whole time. I was like 19. I'd already read all this anthropology on my own after dropping out of high school. And then they were just saying outdated things in my college course. And so I started arguing with them, but I didn't have the
okay.
like, facilities at the time to actually argue back really in an effective way.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's just a constant thing for me. I've never been able to maintain my focus in school ever. And aside from elementary school, where they were like, Peter is talented and gifted, we're going to put him in this special program where he can go do video production and like all these other cool Lego physics and stuff.
Yeah.
And then yeah, I got to middle school and it was like, there's no funding for that, and now you're just a bad student. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. It's truly, it makes me sad to know, like, especially in underfunded schools, how many kids just sit there suffering, being told that, not being told directly that you're stupid, but feeling that way because of
totally,
the way the system is. And
exactly.
like, I hate to be like the system, but like it's just what it is. Like
Yeah.
it, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
when I got to high school, they put me in like the remedial classes for things, even though I would like scored high on tests. I just never did homework because why the fuck?
mhm.
You can't even focus at school. How the fuck am I supposed to focus at
Yeah, I
home
didn't do it either.
after the
Yeah.
fact? Right? It's absurd.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they put me in like a remedial class, and that's when I was like looking around at all the people who I knew had poor self-esteem and thought they weren't as smart as the kid in like the honors classes, right? And it was like me being in that class going, none of these people are stupid. They're all fucking geniuses in their own right. And this whole system is just like making us all feel like shit.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was like, I got to get the fuck out of here. Also, civilization's going to collapse and I need to go learn wilderness survival instead, which
Yeah.
is what I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I'm glad you bring that up too, because it's like a big proponent or a big thing that I like am a proponent of is, and are you familiar with Donnie Dust?
Yeah.
Yeah. So him and I, we had him on our podcast a while back, and like we chatted about, like he said, creativity is your best tool. Like it's the number one survivor tool. You don't need a straw. You don't need, a backpack. You need creativity because then you can make those.
Totally.
Um, and for me, it's like where anthropology comes into that is like understanding how the indigenous people lived in the area you are right now, or where I am, or where anyone is, how they lived is exactly how you're going to live when society breaks down. Because you need to know what kind of stone tools there are to use, or if there are none, what plants to use. If it's a nuclear holocaust and all the plants are dead, you're kind of fucked anyway. But like where to get water, how to process it, what animals are there, and like learning from the, like it's the most important skill you could know is knowing like how the indigenous people lived there before. And it's just so sad we don't learn about it, or how to
Totally.
make stone tools or shelters
Right.
or anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I became super connected here to the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and learned Chinnequawa, which is their trade language, heritage
Wow.
language of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. It's a pidgin, so it's not as complex as
Mm.
a mother tongue. But yeah, it's awesome to have learned that language because then you can, um, place names that are still named after, you know, resources. For example, like Tukwila is a name of a place, but it's also hazelnuts.
Huh.
So you can kind of infer certain things around that, right? One of the interesting things is that the and you'll like this, I think. Excuse me.
What?
The worst insult you can call somebody in Chinnequawa is kamuksh, which means dog.
Really?
And it's because the villages here, the semi-sedentary villages, their domesticated dogs that they had, well, there was the wool dog, which a lot of people know about, but also in Chinookan villages here, dogs were essentially like sewage systems where like people would defecate in the village and dogs would eat it and then were trained to take it out of the village and then go defecate in the forest somewhere. So
Huh.
essentially, when you were calling somebody a kamuk, you were calling them like a shit eater, which is really
Gotcha.
fucked up.
Huh. Um,
But yeah, dogs, they do like poop. So it's not like they were,
it's very common for
yeah,
societies to do that. They just eat the poop.
yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Didn't know that. That's a cool. Yeah, dog linguistics is also just fascinating, and
Mm,
like calling people a dog because it could mean like you're a gross person. It could mean you're sexually promiscuous. It could mean you're cool. Like it's like the F word.
mm.
Like it can mean like
Yeah,
anything.
totally. Yeah, that
Yeah.
is really interesting. I never thought about that. That's awesome.
Yeah. Um, trying to think if I had any other questions for you. Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, like what do you think's going on like right now? Like is just are you just like salivating or like I mean not salivating, but like you know what I mean?
You mean with the state of the world?
Yeah. Like are you just like read the book?
Um, you mean like can you be more specific?
Yeah, well, I guess because you said it before, it's not like rewilding means like go back into the woods and just be primal. It's like how to take society back to like, a non-industrial means.
Yeah,
But like, um, yeah, I guess I can further it like just with what's going on and like watching all this like refugee crisis and like all this like, nuclear threat stuff like that. It just makes me I feel a little more confident. I mean, sitting over here in America, I have no right to speak, but
totally.
like knowing that like I could go into the woods and like be okay growing food and like hunting and doing stuff like that. But like I think a lot of people who aren't in touch with that part of themselves like don't probably are a lot more fearful right now. Um
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't celebrate the collapse of civilization.
sure.
It's on the one hand, I do as a way of on the one hand, it's like to me, civilization is the Anthropocene. The extinction that we're seeing, civilization is the apex society that has caused the sixth mass extinction. And I define,
Huh.
I can go down the whole rabbit hole of how I define civilization and how I actually think of it as like physics in the way like a forest fire is physics. And the main components that drive and create a civilization. I don't conflate the word civilization with civil society. I think there are plenty of civil societies that are not civilization.
Right.
But civilization dictionary definition requires writing. Writing alone is a symptom of an agricultural society that developed. Like writing only develops in agricultural societies where they're trying to, figure out how to delineate the grain between different people. Uh,
Sales. Yeah.
Sales, yeah, and
Yeah.
usually it's an elite that's created it to figure out how to distribute it unequally for themselves or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Um, so if that's civilization, then it has to be, all kinds of these other things that create Neolithic sites that grow to the point of requiring writing or whatever, right? Um, so I don't celebrate the death, the disease, the war, the destruction that can come with the collapse of complex societies. But I do celebrate the end of the sixth extinction, the end of the growth of civilization that is killing off the rest of the things on the planet. So, um, but at 16, I dropped out of high school and ran away from home because I thought civilization was going to collapse like the next year or whatever, right? And it's been 23 years, 24 years. And I was like driving through downtown Portland last year and everything's like boarded up. There's uprisings, the pandemic, and I'm just like, part of me is just like so elated. It's like ripping the band-aid off or something, right? It's like this thing you've been anticipating for so long. Like in the first days of the pandemic, I was like driving down the freeway. There's like no traffic, giant neon sign on the freeway that says like, stay home, COVID-19, and I just got this
Yeah.
shit-eating grin on my face. I was just like, it's finally fucking happening. Like, Jesus.
Yeah.
Um,
I just I saw one that said like we're all in this together and it was like no one on there. I know that exact feeling and I was just like wow, it is happening.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and so here's when and obviously there's a level of recovery that's happening, but I was at the hospital a few years ago. My mom has dementia and has been in a decline for years. And
Sorry to hear
when
that.
thanks, yeah, when the first incident happened and she was in the emergency room, the doctor like pulls my siblings and I out in the hallway and he's like, okay, And I use this example all the time now when I'm talking about collapse, but because it's personal, but it relates to the culture at large. But he's like, okay, here's the deal. Your mom was up here. He holds his hand up, high. Now she's down here. He holds his hand down very low. She's never going to be up here again. Holds his hand back all the way. She might come here somewhere in the middle, but she's never going to be up here. And this is just going to be what her life looks like stepping downstairs, going up and down, but never going back up to where it was before. Right. Mm-hmm. And I just think about that that's essentially collapse, right? There's like micro recoveries, declines, micro recoveries, rapid declines. It's not something that happens like overnight per se, except in the instance of a thing like, holy shit, Russia's fucking invading us. I saw a Twitter post while doom scrolling last night that was like, somebody had reposted a person from Ukraine who said, I almost said the Ukraine, there I am, Russian propaganda.
Yeah, I've been doing it too.
A post from a Ukrainian person that said like, hey, remember like 5 days ago when we were complaining that the sushi we ordered didn't come with this particular sauce or whatever, and now we're like worried about like he's getting a sandwich of military, from whatever, and I just, some shit like that can happen fucking fast. Right. And that is collapse versus like, overall decline versus like those collapses that happen on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. I feel confident I don't think that anyone, there's like preppers, right? Which I don't think of rewilding as prepping. I think of rewilding as like becoming resilient by connecting to your land base, by connecting to the things that we need to survive on a regenerative, localized level. But the problem is, say you learn all of the edible plants in your town and your area, and then a military empire comes in and you have to get the fuck out of there. You're right. And now you're being pushed somewhere else as a refugee. Like there's just no way to know what any particular, or you stockpile all these things and then you get pushed out. You can't bring any of them with you because you can only carry what you can put in your backpack, right? Or what you run out of gas, and then where are you going to carry your stuff? So in terms of like that kind of decline, those kinds of like the warfare, mass migration, there's really no way to like fully prepare for those kinds of things other than just being adaptable. And I don't think that there will ever be, for the last 20 years, I've focused on a particular region called the Malala River Corridor as the sort of wild space that I could evacuate to in an emergency. And 2 years ago, the entire thing burned down in the forest fires that happened here on the West Coast. And we have not been allowed access in 2 years. So the apocalypse came to the place that I was prepping to go to when the apocalypse comes. So what do you do? Like, there's just you just have to be adaptable and willing to transform. To bring this back into dogs. That's one of the things I think about the most, and how I want to connect more and be safer is I really do feel like having a dog as a companion as things transition. You can have it for defense, you can have it to help you hunt, you can have it if you need to eat it. One of my friends jokingly calls everybody's pets famine food, which is like vulgar and sad, but also at the same time it's like a reality, right?
Pre 300 years ago, everyone has eaten dogs. It's just archaeologically, it's a fact.
And even, I would say even in my studies about cannibalism, people 100 and more years ago were eating people in different kinds of ways all around the world, including, quote unquote, medicinal cannibalism in Europe that was still happening. The last like human blood sale, back in the day, executioners would like sell body parts to people. And the last one,
I didn't know that.
Yeah. There's a really great book called Consuming Grief, Compassionate Cannibalism Among an Amazonian Society. But it has a whole like preface about European cannibalism and the medicines. And one of the things they talk about is like executioners would, like during the guillotine, they'd like cut people's heads off, and poor people would pay them to run up with cups and fill their cups with the blood so that they could get iron back into their diet. And the last one that happened was in like 1904.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. I would rather eat a dog before a person, just personally. But
Yeah. Oh, that's nuts, man. Didn't know that. I knew they
Yeah,
ate like the mummy stuff or like
totally.
the
Yeah, the word
yeah.
mummy comes from that. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, man. And like watching the refugees like go, it's like so sad. But like the mother and the children and the elderly people that are going, but like a lot of them are carrying like little teacup dogs like in their purses. And like
Totally.
I haven't seen like a lab or like a dog like on a leash. It's always a dog that's being carried. So like it makes me think like maybe I just haven't seen that in the news yet, but the big dogs are just left behind because they can scavenge and they'll be okay
Mm.
and they can find shelter inside at night, or the men are taking care of them at night. And like I would keep my dog if I was defending the Ukraine. He would eat somebody. But like the Ukraine, sorry.
Yeah.
I said defending the nation. There we go.
Mm.
But like, yeah, it's just my thought process. I don't have children, so like just watching people go with their dogs, I have to constantly calculate what would I do. And I would be living in Brooklyn right now still if I didn't have a dog because I can't afford a place there where he could live. Like I just live out,
Yeah.
back down south still. But like it's a constant thing that like people don't really think about as a logistical thing you have to do. Like some people are just like, oh, I'll get a dog, but like it's a living creature that you
Totally.
have compassion for, that you have to think about in like a crisis like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's
So when you die, do you want your dog killed and buried with you? I'm just kidding.
I've put thought into it, but like I don't know how you could like put that in your will. Like I guess we'll respect his wishes.
Yeah.
I don't know what would happen to him, but yeah, it definitely does interest me in how people, like the woman definitely didn't commit suicide to be buried with the puppy, maybe,
Right.
but
Yeah.
like I think it was the dog was killed to live with the lady, and that's an interesting thought. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Another podcast asked me if I would eat my dog, actually, so I always get one of these. Yeah,
I think the burial one's a little nicer, but maybe not.
it
I
is.
don't know.
Yeah, but yeah, apocalypse food or whatever your friend said.
Yeah.
Famine food.
Yeah, famine food. Yeah, are there any other last things you'd like to say?
Um, yeah, I guess this would make sense for the podcast here too. What I try to tell people is like a dog is, and for people who don't like really even like have dogs or like dogs, like your dog and a cat by extent as well is a connection. It's like an artifact to the ancient world that like humans used to live in. So like I grew up in New York, so like you're in a literal concrete jungle where there's no wild. Central Park is nice, but like I don't live in the woods. There's like you could live in that entire your whole life, but like if you have a dog, you still have a living, breathing connection that like smells, feels, and touches, and like, I mean, I wouldn't say tastes like, but looks like something from the Ice Age that lives with you. And like it's just a grounding thing that like we are still animals, and like you live with one, and it brings you back to that time. So I think it's important that dogs stay around, and I think that's why they have, is because they're a shared humanity with us.
Totally. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
awesome. I love that. Cool. Well, thank you for coming on. I'd love to keep talking, but I feel like we've, gone the amount of time any listener is going to want to listen for whatever
Sure,
for
man.
one podcast. But yeah, maybe we'll have you on again in the
I've
future.
loved this. I've learned quite a bit.
Cool.
So this is my favorite one I've been on. So anytime.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guests and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and support my work by becoming a patron of the Rewilding podcast at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. And as always, you can help by writing a review on Apple Podcasts and make sure to share on social media. Thank you for listening. Until next time.